Well, we were mostly an NBC News family growing up, and I can still remember the deep, slightly mushy voice of Tom Brokaw delivering the evening news. No matter what was going on, there was something reassuring about it. This authoritative figure who would tell us what happened in the world that day. I'm John Zieger, and back then the term mainstream media wasn't yet a slur. And according to Gallup, more than 70% of Americans had high or very high trust in news media. Someone once said the role of the free press is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. But here's the thing. Many, maybe most, of the biggest media institutions today are wholly owned by the comfortable. The Washington Post, the LA Times, CBS News, ABC, all owned by multi-billionaires individually or by enormous conglomerates. We're seeing networks explicitly agree to ideological monitoring of their coverage or to pull their punches on important stories. At the same time, independent media is on the rise. That brings freedom and innovation, but with a precarious business model. And for some of that independent media, building an audience seems to be calling them toward extremes of irresponsibility. Flirting with conspiracy theories, defending the indefensible, and even for responsible independent media, opinion and commentary can be a lot more profitable than journalism, which leaves us caught between institutions owned by the powerful with an abundance of resources, but a conspicuous lack of courage in many cases, and scrappy independents chasing clicks, sometimes into dangerous territory. So what comes next in news? How do we rebuild trust when the economics and ownership structures seem stacked against the very mission of journalism?
I'm Lisa Senecal. Today, John and I are talking with the legendary newsman, John Harwood, who spent decades at newspapers and cable news programs before moving to Zeteo, a new independent media venture where he writes for and hosts The Stakes with John Harwood. He's lived through the transition from the inside, so we're really eager to get his thoughts on where journalism has been, where it's going, and whether we can ever rebuild the kind of trust that we once had. So, John Harwood, welcome to Signal Fire, and thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So we want to dive right in. As I just said, for decades, you were part of what we now refer to as traditional media or legacy media, but those really seem like misnomers to me. What we have right now was not the tradition. It's not the legacy of the people we think having started mainstream news. So how do you think those terms even apply to what corporate media is now? Because it hasn't always been like this, right?
It absolutely hasn't. And let me just step back for a minute and remind you that I was bathed in this ecosystem from childhood. My dad was a major reporter and editor at the Washington Post. In fact, he was the first ombudsman at the Washington Post, at any major American newspaper, who was asked to respond to complaints from conservatives of bias against Richard Nixon and his White House and conservatives more broadly. At that time, it wasn't called the mainstream media or the corporate media. It was called the Eastern Liberal Press, ELP. Pat Buchanan was worked in the Nixon White House and was somebody who jousted with reporters all the time. My dad found at the time that there was some basis for complaints about the press, given the blind spots reporters had, given where they came from. After World War II, major media organizations were flush with veterans, and at the largest establishment, the most acclaimed establishments, veterans from the Ivy League as well. And so there was a certain mindset that came there. That's why my dad was picked to be the ombudsman. He was an orphan kid from the Midwest, became an Iwo Jima Marine in World War II, and then went to college on the GI Bill and went into journalism. So he wasn't of that sort of privileged background. And he thought there were blind spots in terms of how journalists at that time perceived and described what we call the working class, cops, firefighters, the kind of people who were not joining the Vietnam protests that so many younger Americans were joining. So I think there was a point then, and there certainly is a point today that the press, the mainstream press, is different to some degree ideologically and personally from the larger population. First of all, almost 100% of us have gone to college, and most Americans have not. And you also have a more secular group of people, people more inclined toward cultural liberalism, not especially religious group of people. So, yes, there's some basis for that. But what we've seen is the reaction on the right, and with the right wing media ecosystem that's developed, is way out of proportion to the sins they were trying to correct. They're doing outright propaganda, whereas what we call the mainstream press reflects their sort of inherent biases by where they came from. They're not trying to do it. They're not purposefully being political actors. Okay, so that's one thing. Second thing is changes within what we call the mainstream media itself. I was fortunate to grow up around a great newspaper and people who work for a great newspaper. And when I got out of school, I worked first for a very fine, medium-sized city newspaper, the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, that was a feeding ground for larger papers later. Young people would go there, they would learn what they were doing, and then they would move up. And there, where my boss was a guy named Nelson Pointer. Nelson Pointer is the one who was in charge of the St. Pete Times, or the owner of the St. Pete Times. He also founded institutions like Congressional Quarterly, somebody of very high integrity, high value for journalism. And his principal interest was not making money, it was doing good journalism. And in fact, he set up a structure to protect the newspaper, it's now called the Tampa Bay Times, from being acquired by a large corporation that might try to wring every last dollar out of it at the expense of journalism. Then I went to the Wall Street Journal, which was also a fine newspaper that was owned by various members of the Bancroft family, who also placed a high premium on journalism. People who worked for the Washington Post, many of whom are friends of mine, worked for the Graham family. The Graham family, like the Chandler family in Los Angeles at the LA Times, were people who were not principally interested in the most money that they could make, but they cared about journalism, they cared about their communities. While they were doing their thing, other papers were being acquired by chains, and gradually that sort of corporate ownership took shape and had meaning. And but my point in describing where I came from and where I worked was, I never experienced ever pressure from a corporation or an owner to change what I was doing. I just didn't think about it. You were aware, perhaps, that if you wrote something very negative about the local car dealer, the car dealer placed big ads in your newspaper, and he might be upset. But that didn't change what we did. And to give you an example of the values that I grew up under, Gene Patterson, who was the editor and chief executive of the St. Pete Times when I joined, he had worked at the Washington Post. He got, while he was in charge of the paper, he got pulled over for DWI. And he called the city desk and dictated a story about his own arrest for DWI and directed that it be placed on the front page. So this is somebody who was not trying to be shady in any respect. He was a very proud veteran of World War II who cared about the country, and like many people returning from the war who had defended freedom and our constitutional democracy, wanted to vindicate that in his journalism. We're in a different situation now. And as you indicated, increasingly media properties are being owned and directed by extremely wealthy people who, certainly in this era, more than any other era, when you know that you have a president who is not constrained by ethics or integrity, is looking to get what he can from people that he can blackmail or extort money from. These people have lots of business interests, and they know that Trump can hurt them. And so they're reacting to that, in some cases by paying off settlements of ridiculous
Yeah.
lawsuits that have no merit, but they're doing it because they're hoping that Trump will think more favorably of them. You saw that at CNN. They decided to move in a direction that was more Trump friendly. ABC News settled a lawsuit that they would have won for this same purpose. So there's a lot of that behavior going on. Same thing at the LA Times. A lot of that behavior going on. And so it's creating pressure on younger journalists that I never faced. I mean, I'm kind of lucky that all this stuff has happened at the end of my career. It would be, it doesn't really matter to me at this point. I'm 69 years old, and I don't, I'm not looking at decades in this business. But if I were 30 and 40 or 50 years old, I would be very worried that I was getting into a business that was going to tax my integrity and make it more difficult to do my job.
How do you imagine that manifests itself for individual journalists in terms of what they cover, in terms of what they don't cover, what question they don't ask at the gaggle of the president? What do you think the connective tissue looks like between this increasing kind of corporate sort of focus on keeping the regime happy and the actual working journalists doing out there trying to get stories?
I think most of it is top down. That is people who report directly to ownership. The closer you get to that point, the more they are feeling pressure. It's probably subtle. So, like, for example, the Washington Post. It's been a great newspaper for a long time. I know a whole lot of people who work there, and they're good journalists. I think in the newsroom of the Washington Post, most people are going about their jobs as they always have. The issue comes when you get to editing decisions, story placement decisions, assignments. I think all of those things are going to weigh on news managers. There will be some pressure for self-censorship, and it's probably greater, I think, in broadcast than in print, because in broadcast you're saying something, it's captured on video, can be repeated over and over again.
Also, the president watches a lot of TV.
Yeah, right.
So, sorry.
And so knowing that if you say something that is offensive to the person in power and the person who's got some level of control or leverage over your boss, you have to worry about your job. And like I say, for me, that's not something I have to worry about. And I didn't worry about it when I was working at CNN or any other place, because my view is if you can't do the job the way you think is right, why do you even have the job? What's the point? It's probably going to be a gradual process of change within organizations. I hope that the magnitude of the change turns out to be limited, and that the concerns that we have are greater than what will actually manifest in the news product. But it's very hard to predict where we go from here, because a lot of things have happened this year that we never expected.
There's so much both sidesisms that happen now in all forms of the media, and how much of that is sort of a mistaken understanding on journalists' part of what the actual role of a free press in a free society is supposed to be, and how much is how much is trying to keep the peace by giving everything equal standing, regardless of whether or not, you could be interviewing one person and one person is speaking factually and one person is speaking in pure fiction, and they both get to present their views and don't seem to get tough follow-up questions. So how much of that is lack of experience, trying to please people internally, trying not to anger the president? It's tough to tell if some of it's just an accident and how much of it is really intentional.
Well, I think elements of all those things come into play. And I want to give some grace to younger reporters who've only known this political
Right.
world that we live in. So if you begin with the very basic ethic of we are fair to both sides, that compels you, especially if you're depending on where you are in the business, compels you to seek out the alternative voice to the voices that you're used to hearing. And they may be less sensitive to the fact that what's actually happened is a moral and intellectual collapse of one side. And so, I've covered the Republican Party for many decades. And what has happened lately is a descent into kind of madness, irrationality, the flight from reason. You don't have good faith policy arguments. You have a whole bunch of dishonesty and noise and bluster from people who can't really defend in an intellectual way their decisions, but they're trying to by sort of force of argument or actual force, governmental force or physical force, prevail within the system. That's the only world that a lot of younger journalists know. But for me, for example, I was seeing a reporter on Twitter, X, reacting to a live shot by Nancy Mace, the Republican congresswoman from South Carolina. And she was just saying hot garbage about Trump and the Epstein files. And it was just absurd stuff. Now, to me, to some people, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to put that person on the air. To me, the stuff she says is outlandish and ridiculous. I don't see any benefit to an audience of putting her on the air. To be honest, I don't see much benefit to putting most things that Donald Trump says on the air, because most of the things he says are untrue, and not just a little bit untrue, but completely untrue. So it's a hard situation if you're covering the president's crazy and nonsensical and living and detached from reality. So to some degree, you put him on to illustrate those qualities. But in terms of what we think of as a journalistic exchange, where you're sincerely trying to get an answer and they're sincerely trying to answer, and maybe you see things differently. This is not that situation. And it is easier for somebody who's watched it for a long time, as I have, to say that directly than it is for younger people.
I suspect that the clip of Nancy Mace or Donald Trump saying something outrageous and sort of obviously untrue and kind of bad faith probably does much better numbers on the internet than the kind of reasonable conversation, right? And so
100%. And the backdrop for all this, as you're indicating, is the financial squeeze on all these news organizations. And that's irrespective of the political squeeze. Set aside polarization and all that. There is a long-term secular decline in the market share driven by the digital revolution for both newspapers and television stations. I mean, they're going down rapidly. Let's say you're running CNN. Your ratings are falling very fast. What do you do about that? Where do you put the brakes on the decline or get new viewers? It may be logical to say that, well, if we appeal to people who we disagree with politically, or who they disagree with us politically, maybe if we're a little more welcoming to them, we can get more viewers. I think that's a losing game. I don't think it works, but that's a reasonable internal conversation for a news manager to have. I don't think any of it's going to matter, because cords are being cut. And, I have 3 grown daughters. None of them subscribe to cable TV.
Yeah.
None of them get a newspaper. They get their news in other ways. And that's true of a whole lot of people. And that's a business fact that is very daunting. And when you layer the political pressures on top of it, it's a bleak moment for the news business. The flip side is people are better educated than they've ever been before. People actually have more information available to them than they ever have before, but they don't invest trust in a small number of large outlets. They get bits and pieces from friends and peers and family members and TikTok and Facebook and fragments flying around all over the place. That's unfortunate for those of us who grew up in a system where we had more influence. I had less influence every day of my journalism career than my dad had coming up in the 60s and 70s. The Washington Post was one of a handful of nationally respected outlets. And when he wrote something that was a significant story, that affected not just what other newspapers did, but what television networks did. It had a lot of clout. And at the beginning of my career, an earlier portion of my career, when I was with the Wall Street Journal, let's say, or with CNBC, when I moved to television in the mid 2000s, I had some level of influence by virtue of the audience that I had. But that's just continued to decline over the course of my career. And, by the end of it, when, CNN took me off the air because they wanted to have less harsh criticism of Trump, it didn't bother me all that much, because I was getting a little bit disenchanted with the ability of cable television to have an impact anyway. What difference did it make that I was saying what I said on television? That's just a reality. And in this independent world, certainly it's less, but that's at least a place where people can plant little seedlings and hope they grow and get big.
How do you think about the ability of independent media, what you're doing at Zateo, what Tara Palmieri is doing at the Red Letter, what the folks at the Bulwark are doing, all to build trust? And does it ever end up, in your mind, do we ever build back a system that looks closer to something like when you started your career, when your dad had his career? Or are we in this kind of post-Tower of Babel moment where you have little audiences that follow particular influences, and that's all you can ever build?
Well, I don't think anything goes in a straight line, so I wouldn't necessarily make a projection from the current trajectory, 10, 20, 30 years in the future. I think back to what produced the kind of golden era of journalism that my dad had his career within. That was, I think, substantially produced by a society that had gone through a universal and unifying event, and that was World War II. Everybody served. Everybody, with a few exceptions, was on the same team. And so, when troops were overseas in Europe or in the Pacific, people from different walks of life were serving alongside one another. And there was something created by that experience that carried over when they came back and entered journalism or politics. There was a greater level of consensus that I think was influenced not just by a higher level of credulity that was inherent to news sources, but it had to do to some degree with the aftermath of the experience they'd been through. And what happened that stuff started to break apart when the society became more disunified in the 1960s over Vietnam, over, cultural change, sexual revolution, civil rights revolution, all that stuff. That was the precursor to the divisions and the polarization that we're experiencing now. So could we have another event that would raise the level of inherent community feeling among the American population? Maybe. I confess, after 9/11, I thought we might be at that moment. I thought, we were for about 2 weeks.
Yeah, right.
And then it
or
faded
COVID,
away.
or COVID for that matter, right? It's similar,
Well,
right? Yeah,
100%.
Yeah.
COVID
Yeah.
could have been that kind of experience.
Yeah.
Something, a novel threat that we hadn't faced before, and had you not had an incompetent maniac in the White House, and who was seeing and then capitalizing on political divisions, you could have had a different effect on the society. So something like that could happen. I mean, if China becomes aggressive toward the United States, if we get into a war with China, that would be a terrible tragedy, but it would also probably have some effect in binding the society closer together.
Yeah.
One of the things I worry about a lot and see as a huge difference from when I was younger and consuming the news is that there used to be quite clear distinctions between news and commentary. And the wall between news and commentary seems to have almost completely disintegrated at this point, so that it can be very difficult to know if you're watching a news program or if you are just listening to opinion. How with new media, and you've made the leap successfully, there are not the same resources at a new media organization that there would have been at a CNN or a CBS or whatever, even with their shrinking budgets. So how does hard news get deeply reported? Do we still end up with investigative reporting, or, our man in Cairo type reporting, so that we can start to have that distinction again between news reporting and then analysis or commentary?
Well, I think we still have a lot of that takes place. It's just, it doesn't stand out as much in the cacophony of voices that we hear throughout the media. So it's difficult to isolate and pick those things out. But let me talk about this in the context of my own career. As I moved through journalism and covered multiple presidential campaigns, I got to a fork in the road that my dad had gotten to at the Washington Post, which is you either try to rise within the editor ranks at a newspaper, let's say, and run a newsroom, be an administrator of a newsroom, hire and fire and direct priorities, or you could have an individual voice, the voice of a columnist or an analyst. My dad did the newspaper administration part. Somebody like David Broder, who I don't know if that name resonates with you, but he was one of the legendary political reporters of when I was a young person. He was an experienced reporter who wrote a column, and he had acquired knowledge and perspective on the subject of politics, and so he had something to say. That was more appealing to me than being an editor. So moving toward analysis, I don't call it opinion. I certainly didn't call it opinion. It's probably somewhat closer in what I'm doing now to opinion, but I still don't think of myself really as an opinion journalist. It was, younger people tend to do the hard news reporting, and the older people are kind of the gray hair of the bunch, and they provide context and perspective and analysis. That's the role that I wanted to play and did play. it was not to say the tax rate should be X or the level of Social Security benefits should be Y or whatever. It was to watch what was going on politically and be able to tell people what it meant and why it was happening. That's what I did. That's a different thing than, flipping through the cable dial and landing on either a news program or an opinion program, Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow for that matter. Those are just different things. I see what I have done as a progression along the same path. And you mentioned the tendency to go for clicks. One of the reasons that I'm at Zateo is that they created Zateo without me and asked me to come write for them. Honestly, I don't have the stomach for clickbait or for trying to lure people in to subscribe to my column. That's Zateo's issue. That's what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the appeal to me. When I left the CNN, taken off the air at CNN, they paid me for 3 years after they took me off the air because I had just signed a new contract, and then my boss got fired, and then the new boss fired me. I was trying to figure out what to do. I had a major interruption. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but I was diagnosed with leukemia a year after I left CNN, and eventually had a bone marrow transplant that I think has cured me of the leukemia. Thank God.
Yeah.
Transplant for my daughter.
Wow.
During that time, Substack was coming to me and saying, why don't you start a Substack and let that be your new outlet? And so many of my friends have started Substacks, and I get the things that they write, and they'll send 5 paragraphs, and then, if you upgrade to paid, you can get the rest of this column.
Right.
Like, I get why people do that, and I respect them. If this is a point at which that's going to be how they make their living, I don't want to do that. And so what Zateo had created their own brand, and they wanted somebody to write the kind of things that I write. And that's great. And I'm writing what I write, and I don't feel that pressure. Obviously, any of us would like to have larger and larger audiences for what we write. But at this point in my life and career, it doesn't matter as much. So, yes, as you guys mentioned before, independent journalists have to be mindful of what attracts eyeballs and figure out ways to get those eyeballs. And that's a challenge, and it could be a corrupting challenge. It can be an intellectual challenge if you're not, assume you're not deceiving people for purposes of clicks, assuming you just want to figure out the most attractive way to lure people to pay $6 a month for your newsletter. That's a great problem-solving challenge, but it's just not one that I want to take on. And God bless all the people who are taking it on. I hope they do well.
You mentioned that your daughters don't subscribe to cable. I don't know whether they subscribe to I think they're not subscribing to a daily newspaper, it sounds like, or at least not one that's delivered. Maybe that's...
It is possible that they have my login information.
There you go. Yes, we have that issue in our house as well. At least to get to the New York Times games. That's so. My sense is, and that this may or may not be true for, I don't want to attribute anything to your children. For mine, it's certainly true, and even for myself, I think that more of my news consumption and more of my kids' news consumption, even more, is short form video on these platforms that are endemic, and they are they're entertainment platforms, but they're also news platforms, and and I wonder what you think of that trend from the not as a sort of societal commentary, although that might be interesting, but more from the perspective of journalists, because what is possible. The sort of the medium is the message quality of short form video, right? You have this 5-inch screen. The algorithm really rewards a face on the screen. There's certain kinds of things that work. There's certain length limitations there. You're competing with funny cat videos and someone slipping on the ice and whatever else is sort of next in the scroll. So I wonder how you think about what it means to do journalism with that as a kind of dominant form.
There's some obvious problems with it. Artificial intelligence is one of them, because you have the threat of being faked out all the time. I was clicking around on YouTube today, and I saw a video that was like John Lennon's performance with Karen Carpenter. That didn't happen, but somebody made an AI video of what it might have been like had it happened. So you can be deceived by those things. Sometimes they can be very powerful, but also misleading. So I see a lot of videos of ICE agents roughing up people, and tear gas situations, and throwing people on the ground. I'm sure that in some of those cases, that video distorts the reality of what actually happened. There have been enough of them that I'm persuaded that there's a whole lot of violent abuse that's going on. But in any individual case, you don't know what happened in the 10 seconds preceding the start of the video or after. I'm starting to, in this sort of independent status, lean into video for the first time, because I've started doing Substack Lives. What I like about them is I have a half an hour conversation with somebody, and it's like I would have done when I was on television, with either an interview if it's a newsmaker, or just a panel discussion conversation if it's somebody who's not a newsmaker. So I enjoy that. But do I know the best way to maximize the audience for that? No. I will say that the people at Zeteo are pretty good about coming up with short form stuff. And I'm like, wow, that's good. That's pretty easy to watch. So I hope that takes off. I don't know how to evaluate the magnitude of short form video as a component of this ecosystem independently. Again, there's so much stuff that it's hard to measure any particular element of the stuff.
There's so many things to worry about when we're talking about what has happened with news media and where it might go. Do you, either in now being part of Zeteo and independent media, or looking what other people are doing, do you see bright spots? Do you find places for hope and maybe some positives in the innovation, and where we might be going with how we cover the news?
I think some organizations are flourishing that ought to flourish. Now, that's my perspective. I think the Bulwark, for example, is an organization that is founded by former Republicans, even former conservative Republicans, some of whom used to bark at me for being unfair to Republicans, and now they're harsher than I am on their former party. I think they are very valuable voices in the ecosystem. That's a bright spot for me. Take individuals. Terry Moran, who was fired by ABC for saying harsh but true things about Stephen Miller. He's now operating independently on Substack. I'm doing a Substack Live with him, in fact, on Thursday. But he's somebody who I think has done an exceptional job in providing a variety of quality content. Terry is a very literate, very well-educated guy. He writes beautifully, as well as delivers content on television, on video in a very compelling way. And so I think the combination that Terry has begun to offer that ranges from reported stories where he'll travel with a crew. I don't know how big the crew is, how it compares to what he had when he was at ABC, but certainly the stuff looks great. He went to Chicago to write about what ICE was doing there. He does that. He does conversations with individuals. He writes a Sunday poem that he infuses with meaning that links to news of the day. That's really creative and smart, and something that, the more of that we have out there, the better off we're going to be. I don't know how big of an audience he's getting for that. There are countless people coming out all the time with new newsletters or pieces of video. The more people are willing to invest in media, realizing that there are limits, I think the more bright spots we're going to find.
That's great. Well, John, thanks so much for taking the time. That's a great way to end it. We really appreciate you, everything you're doing. I hope people will continue to follow your work and join your, watch your Substack live conversations. I will. I've been going through the last few things you've done, as well as some older material, and just looking forward to continuing to follow you on Zeteo. So thanks very much.
Hey, thanks so much. Really appreciate the conversation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
thank you so much, John. True pleasure.
So, John Harwood, what'd you think?
There are few people. There's a short list of journalists, both print and I guess I would include radio too, and TV, who are sort of my gold standard of news people. And John Harwood is one of them. So an incredible honor to be able to speak with him. I love to see that he has made this leap, and that there is this entity that he's been able to join that serves his needs and makes sense and is keeping his voice out there, and he's adopting the new technology. The business model he sort of alluded to with independent creators who don't have that ability to join on an established network. That business model really worries me, because not only are you constantly, in need of more subscribers, and most people are a one-man band, but you also, if you decide to take a 2-week vacation, you have no content, and subscriptions disappear so quickly. And then you're back to trying to get back to where you were before you took that time away. So the business model is tough.
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a similar sense of this, tremendous kind of, I don't know what the right word is, almost nostalgia for this time when we had this kind of the sort of professionalism of journalism, people who took their role really seriously, and that kind of came through, that whole conversation. You sort of feel that the sense of responsibility, and so what a neat opportunity to get to chat with John. And it's an interesting, right? This sort of, how do you voices like John Harwood and so many other people who've spent a lifetime building experience in their fields. We need to keep hearing from those people, and the question of like, what is their place in new media? As you say, it's great that he has found a place at Zeteo that fits what he wants to do, to create content, but not necessarily to be out there kind of flogging the social media, sort of feeds. But it seems to me we need a lot more of that, and we're going to need a lot more of it, right? As institutional journalism just sort of continues to sort of shed people. So super interesting, lot of threads for us to pull in conversations over the next few weeks, and I'm looking forward to doing that.
Yeah, me too. Another great conversation coming up next Wednesday. So please do make sure you share the podcast, like it, give us a review, and we will be back here every Wednesday with another episode of Sigma Fire. So thank you so much for joining us.